Having looked at one of the largest sculptures in ancient Egypt, let's look at something a little more human-sized, in this case, a statue of Khafre. And statuary would have been very important to the Egyptians. As I alluded to before, it gives a sense of permanence of identity. Many of these are going to be Ka statues, although when you see a statue of the pharaoh, unless you're sure it comes from a tomb, oftentimes it is going to be propaganda, a symbol of power, sort of describing oneself to the people. So this becomes oftentimes a substitute body for the soul. And that's important because the Egyptians understand that sometimes mummification goes wrong, sometimes datification goes wrong, sometimes catification goes wrong. They mummified cats too, mostly because they were probably terrified of them. They are our evil overlords after all. But let's get back to the statue. The statue itself is diorite. Now, diorite is a hard volcanic stone, and the way that they would have carved it would have been the use of wood and stone tools. After all, I can carve stone with any material that's going to be harder than, equal to or harder than the stone. We do see some bronze tools. Mostly though, they would use diorite on diorite. Round pounding tools. We see here these stone tools. We have a little bronze tool here, probably for detail. These mauls would be used primarily to hit something else, although you can use wood and abrasion, sand, on these statues as well to create something beautiful, although it takes time. And to sand it, obviously they don't have sandpaper, you would take papyrus, spread sand on the surface, and use the papyrus to protect your hand while rubbing down the sculpture. The piece is known as, or is termed frontal. In other words, we are meant to see it entirely from the front and quite rigid. Behind him, we see Horus. So you see him there protecting the pharaoh behind him. The body form is rather interesting though. Now, in the ancient world, there are lots of diseases that people would catch. Even the pharaoh would get things like smallpox or various diseases of the skin, etc. And so in this case, we know that this is likely an idealization, in this case of the body and of the face, to proclaim the divine nature. It's not about remembering what he actually looked like. There's no need for that. The body also, I'm going to go back a couple of slides here, looks pretty impressive. He looks like he hits his 5x5 squats and drinks his protein shakes. Now, would the pharaoh actually do that? And the likelihood is no, he wouldn't. He's not doing any physical labor. He's the pharaoh. It wouldn't look like that. This again is idealization. Remember who the pharaoh is. The pharaoh is not a representation of a god. The pharaoh is a god. And therefore, you're going to idealize him because you really don't want to tick off a god by showing the weaknesses of his earthly vessel, which is exactly what we're dealing with here. And we see Horus again there protecting the pharaoh, representing the pharaoh. He is the pharaoh in many ways. So that's part of why we get that idealized image. At the end of the day, this idealization should look pretty darn familiar, because the same idealization they're using on a god or pharaoh here is the same that we see at Abercrombie or in catalogs or on Instasnap a Chatterbook if you happen to be a male. This body form hasn't changed. The body ideal, the masculine body ideal, simply hasn't changed going back to the ancient Egyptians. And this idea of idealizing ourselves, while we think of it as something that comes from the various filters on Instasnap a Chatterbook, really isn't. It's something that we've been doing for millennia. And we do it for various reasons, not just to make ourselves look good, but sometimes because of who we are representing or what they represent to us.